now tapped in to DZ TV, where you could be you, I could be me. Like, share, subscribe. One.
All of our data is being mismanaged and mishandled and misappropriated by companies around the world, both institutions around the world, both governmental and corporate. You mentioned sort of my corporate background in intelligence, and this is something that I think is opaque, and it's not understood by a lot of people who haven't been in government, and particularly in the intelligence community, or IC as they call it, where it's become really the standard of business. And this opacity, this lack of transparency is entirely by design. You are being told that you have agreed, that you have consented to the creation of perfect records about your private lives by 1,000 companies and industries that you don't know, that you don't have a meaningful relationship, that you don't even pay. You don't understand how they work. You don't have a vote over this. They might not even be in your country. And yet you are subject to their policies. You are subject to their powers. You are subject to their prerogatives. And that's just commerce. When we talk about national power, when we talk about state power, when we move over history as technology advances, right? We need to understand how these powers are tested out. When we see what people are willing to tolerate, how much you can do before people really rebel and revolt and say, this is too far. Power is always applied first and most aggressively against the unprotected and minorities. They are the proving grounds because they are the ones with the least voice. They are the ones with the fewest friends. They are the ones that you can push around without expecting to get hit back hard enough that it will actually hurt, that it will shape your behavior. But the thing is, we've seen this over the last 2 decades, the war on terrorism, happen in incredible ways, from the war on a religion, on a belief, on a system, and all the governments that come with it. Nobody cared when they created drones and they started flying them over Afghanistan and places like Yemen, CIA and NSA partnering up programs that were literally called shenanigans. And what they were doing was they were mapping all the cell phones of all the people in the city, seeing where they went to sleep. They could know which cell phone belonged to which building if they wanted to bomb someone. And now, if we can bring up that flight map of Portland, we see these same technologies of flying circuits around a city to observe people, to observe devices, and they deny it in this way and that way, and maybe they aren't doing it this way or that way. But the technology exists, they have it, they buy it, they don't tell anybody about it. It's being procured, you see it in the budgets. And then every time there's a protest now, whether it's in Baltimore, whether it's in Portland, whether it's in Austin, there is a plane in the sky keeping an eye on us. And even if it's not, there's an eye in our pocket that we pay for that's keeping an eye on us. These technologies are forged in the war front, but they have a way of moving to the home front. And they're used against the disenfranchised. They're used against the people with the least. They're used against vulnerable minorities. And then they're used against everyone. Even if you feel like this doesn't affect you personally, it does, and it will in time. And we need to understand that, the pandemic will eventually recede. We do inevitably make progress towards a more just society on the backs of people that sacrificed their lives to win it for us. But the rights we lose to every emergency law that passes because we are afraid we never get those back. Pandemic recedes, but the tide of rights, that recedes too. And I'll wrap this up because I'll cede my time to everybody else. I think I've said enough. I think we need to understand that when we talk about technologists, when we talk about people working at Facebook, when we talk about people on the street who are standing up and exposing themselves to violence, to protect other people from violence, this stuff matters. That is the only way the world gets better. It's not enough to read. It's not enough to believe in something. It's not enough to write something. You have to eventually stand for something if you want things to change. What is changing today is the fundamental structure in the relationship of the individual, the citizen, the non-citizen, to the institution, be it corporate or governmental. And it's very fashionable, I think, in the United States and a lot of developed countries generally, to think about corporations as arms of government. We see the chummy relationship. We see how much influence happens there. But when we think about who has the most influence over what laws get written and what laws get passed in the United States, I think we need to seriously consider that perhaps it's government that's becoming an arm of the corporation. They're entirely willing to provide lip service. If the only thing that they feel that is demanded of them, of a social movement, is to change their language, is to issue a press release, is to put out, an ad campaign, they are all behind that. They're like, oh, we are the ally of allies. We're here for you all the way. As long as it doesn't impact their business, as long as it doesn't impact their power, as long as it doesn't impact their operations, they're on side with it. But we need to think about, again, what are the roots of the inequality that's driving all of these crises to the fore, that is making problems into crises. And I think that goes all through this, whether we're talking about economy, whether we're talking about political expression, whether we are talking about access to justice, whether we are talking about freedom from violence. All of these things centrally revolve around the axis of power. And again, that's very much true in surveillance. It's about control, it's about who has influence over society, and that is what the struggles today truly represent. We have an indentured generation that has been told they will be working for the rest of their lives just to break even on the mistakes of the last. And that generation doesn't want to be accountable for it. They refuse even responsibility for it. And the members of that generation who are on the right side of history, they aren't the ones who call the shots. They aren't the ones that have power. And I think it's important to remember that this is a constant theme throughout history. There were people who saw injustice as it was developing and called it injustice and stood up against it. And they were minimized, they were crushed, they were marginalized again and again and again, but they didn't stop. And eventually they built a critical mass. Eventually they built a movement. Eventually they coordinated. Eventually they organized. And eventually they persuaded the whole of society, the whole of history, that what had just moments ago been normal was now unspeakable. And it's just, I'll end on a historic note here because I've gone too long. It's important to remember that connection between the development of new and controversial powers, abilities, authorities, laws, and the close to immediate application of them against minorities, and particularly blacks in the United States. That's our history. In her book, Dark Matters on the Surveillance of Blackness, I think it was, Simone Brown wrote that the first American surveillance laws were lantern laws that required black, mixed, and indigenous people to literally carry candlelit lanterns after sunset to make them easier to watch as they went about whatever it was, anytime they were not in the company of a white person. Effectively, any visible minority, and this is back in the 17th century, in New York, who wasn't literally lighting themselves up, was subject to be stopped and frisked. We need to create a world where people who aren't exactly like us, from ways big to ways small, are subjects rather than equals. This whole idea of government, this whole idea of democracy, it only works when we all have a seat at the table. And there's this fundamental presumption, particularly in these fractious times, with this sort of new rising authoritarianism, that they believe, well, as long as you have the majority, everything's okay. But the majority can't vote away the rights of the minority, or they weren't rights. And it's important for us to remember that.
Listen. You're in a privileged position to learn a thing or two. Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. What?